I moved into a small second-floor apartment about 2 years ago. It wasn't much, just a basic one-bedroom in an older complex, but it was cheap and close to work. Most of the tenants were older, quiet people who kept themselves, which suited me perfectly. I'm a private person by nature, and I like the idea of being left alone. The only neighbor I ever really noticed was this guy who lived directly across the courtyard from me. He was probably mid-40s, skinny, and always wore the same gray hoodie and jeans no matter the weather. He had this habit of sitting outside his door, smoking for hours at a time. At first, I didn't think anything of it. People smoke. People sit outside. No big deal. But after a few weeks, I realized something. It didn't matter what time I left for work or came home, morning, afternoon, late at night. He was always there. And he wasn't just smoking casually. He was watching. It wasn't obvious at first. He'd glance up when I walked by, sometimes get a lazy nod, but his eyes would stay locked on me until I disappeared into my apartment. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe he was just bored. Maybe I was overthinking it. But then little things started happening. One evening, after a long shift, I got home and noticed my doormat was slightly crooked. I always straighten it before leaving. It's just one of those habits you don't think about until something feels off. I brushed it off as a wind. A few days later, though, I found a cigarette butt tucked neatly under the edge of the mat. I don't smoke. None of my friends do either. I try to rationalize it. Maybe the maintenance guy dropped it. Maybe it blew over from somewhere else. But it kept happening. Every few nights, another butt, always crushed out carefully, always tucked just barely out of sight. I started using the back stairs instead of the front entrance, parking farther away just to avoid walking past his unit. I figured if I stopped being visible, he'd lose interest. It seemed to work for a while, until one night, I woke up around 2 a.m. to get a glass of water. As I passed through the living room, I noticed the blinds on the sliding glass door to the balcony were slightly open, just enough for someone to see inside. I never leave them like that, heart pounding. I walked over and peeked through the gap. Across the courtyard, half hidden by the shadows near his door, was my neighbor, standing there, facing directly at my unit, not moving, not smoking, just watching. I closed the blinds immediately, double-checked the locks, and turned off the lights. I sat in the dark for hours after that, listening, waiting for any sound. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I told myself again it was probably just a coincidence. Maybe he was out for a smoke and happened to be looking my way. But deep down I knew things escalated after that. One evening, I came home and found my back door, the one I'd been using to avoid him, unlocked. I knew, without a doubt, I had locked it that morning. I always check it twice. Nothing inside was missing. Nothing was out of place. But the idea that someone could have been inside while I was gone made my skin crawl. I called the landlord the next day and asked if I could change the locks. They agreed, but said it would take a few days to schedule maintenance. That night was the worst. I was lying in bed, trying to convince myself everything was fine when I heard it. A soft tapping sound. Not a knock. A gentle, rhythmic tap. Tap, tap coming from the sliding glass door. I froze. It continued. Slow. Deliberate. I grabbed my phone, heart pounding so loud I could barely hear the 911 operator when she answered. I whispered that someone was on my balcony trying to break in. She told me to stay on the line and hide. I crept into the hallway, crouching low, and peeked toward the living room. The blinds were still closed, but the tapping was louder now, more insistent. I knelt down near the edge of the blinds and lifted one corner just slightly. Standing on my balcony, inches from the glass, was my neighbor. His face was so close I could see the fog from his breath on the window. He was smiling, not a normal smile. It was strained, almost painful looking, stretching too wide across his face. His eyes were locked right on the spot where I was peeking. I dropped the blind instantly, heart racing out of my chest. I stayed crouched in the hallway, whispering updates to the 911 operator, waiting for what felt like forever. At some point, the tapping stopped. When the police finally arrived about 10 minutes later, they searched the property but found no sign of him. He had disappeared, slipping back into the shadows just like always. But they did find something else. Around the side of the building, beneath my balcony, there were muddy shoe prints on the wall, like someone had climbed up. They ran his name after I pointed them to his unit. Turns out he had a prior record. Burglary. 2 arrests. No current warrant. But without concrete evidence, no breaking and entering, no injuries, there wasn't much they could do except document the incident. I moved out the next week. Found a new apartment across town in a secure building with cameras and keycard entry. I didn't even leave a forwarding address. I didn't want him to find me. To this day, I still have trouble sleeping. Sometimes in the middle of the night, I'll wake up suddenly, convinced I hear that faint tapping sound again. I have to check every door, every window, every lock, because no matter how far I moved, part of me is still sure he's out there, still watching. About a year ago, I moved into a new apartment complex after finally getting promoted at work. It wasn't anything fancy, just a 1-bedroom on the 3rd floor, but it was in a decent part of town, close to everything I needed. For the first few weeks, things were normal. I barely saw any of my neighbors except for a polite wave here and there. It was quiet, and honestly, I liked it that way. Then one evening, about a month after moving in, a new guy moved into the unit right across from mine. I remember seeing him hauling boxes in around 8 or 9 p.m., which struck me as odd. Most people moved during the day, but whatever, maybe he worked late. He was probably in his late 30s, thin, with messy hair and clothes that looked a little too big for him. I gave him a friendly nod when I passed by. He didn't smile back, didn't say anything, just stared at me, not in a hostile way, but not exactly normal either, like he was studying me. I figured he might just be shy. I didn't think too much of it at the time. That night, around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of loud scraping and banging coming from across the hall. It sounded like furniture being dragged across the floor. I assumed he was just getting his apartment set up and tried to ignore it, but it didn't stop. For hours, the sound continued. Shuffling, dragging, occasional thumps against the wall. At one point, I got up, walked to the peephole, and looked out. The hallway was empty, but I could hear muffled movement from behind his door. It honestly sounded like he was pacing back and forth rapidly, heavy footsteps going back and forth across the room. I almost knocked to tell him to keep it down, but decided against it. I didn't want to start a conflict with a new neighbor. The next morning, everything seemed back to normal. The hallway was quiet. His door was closed. I went to work and forgot about it, but over the next week, things started to get weirder. Every night, around the same time, between 1 and 3 a.m., the noises would start. Sometimes it was the sound of furniture moving. Sometimes it was strange tapping sounds against the wall that bordered our units. One night, I even heard what sounded like whispering. Low, fast whispers, too quiet to make out the words. I knew it was coming from his apartment. I started losing sleep over it. I thought about complaining to the landlord, but kept putting it off. Maybe he'd settle in soon, and the noise would stop. Then came the night I couldn't ignore it anymore. It was around 2:30 a.m. when I woke up to something new. Soft knocking. Not on my door, on my bedroom wall. The wall I shared with his apartment. It was steady. One knock every few seconds. Deliberate, not random creaks or settling. I lay there in the dark, staring at the wall, too scared to move. After maybe a minute, it stopped. I waited, heart hammering in my chest, listening. Then my phone buzzed. I had a text from an unknown number. It just said, "I can hear you breathing." I sat up so fast I almost fell out of bed. I didn't recognize the number. My heart was racing. I checked the peephole again, but didn't see anything. That's when I decided enough was enough. I called the police. 2 officers showed up about 15 minutes later. I explained everything about the noises, the strange behavior, the text. They knocked on his door several times. No answer. Finally, they got the building manager to unlock it. The unit was empty, completely empty. No furniture, No boxes, nothing but bare floors and walls. The place looked like no one had ever moved in at all. The manager looked as confused as I was. He swore that no one had officially rented that unit yet. It had been vacant for months. I showed the police a text, but they couldn't trace an unknown number without a warrant. And since no crime had technically been committed, there wasn't much they could do. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the building made my skin crawl. I moved out 2 weeks later. I don't know who or what was living across the hall those nights. I don't know if it was some elaborate prank or something worse. But sometimes when I'm alone at night and my phone buzzes unexpectedly, I still hesitate before looking. Because deep down, I'm terrified I'll see another message, telling me they're still listening. A few years ago, I lived in a low-rise apartment building in a quiet part of town. It wasn't the best place, but it was affordable, and most of the tenants kept to themselves. I lived on the second floor, and across the hall from me was apartment B6. For the first 6 months I lived there, B6 was empty. Then one day, I noticed the door was cracked open slightly and some moving boxes were stacked inside. I figured someone new had moved in. Didn't think much of it. A few days later, I ran into the new tenant in the hallway. He was older, probably late 50s, wearing stained jeans and a gray thermal shirt. His hair was thinning and messy, and he walked with a strange shuffle, like his shoes were too big or his legs didn't bend right. I said, "Hey," like I normally do when I pass someone in the building. He didn't respond. He just stared at me with his flat, emotionless look and mumbled something I couldn't make out before walking into his apartment and closing the door. Weird, but whatever. I just assumed he was socially awkward or maybe hard of hearing. That week, I started noticing small things that felt off. I'd come home from work and find that my doormat had been moved or flipped over. Once, my mailbox was slightly open. Another time, I swear I locked my door, but when I got back, it was unlocked. Nothing was missing, so I figured maybe I just forgot. Then came the night I heard him. It was around 11:30 p.m. I was watching TV when I heard a loud, choking sound from the hallway. At first, I thought someone was sick or hurt. I muted the TV and listened. The sound came again, this time more clearly, heavy, wet breathing. I got up and looked through the peephole. The hallway was dim, but I could just barely make out a figure standing completely still in front of my door. It was him, just standing there, maybe a foot away from my door, not knocking, not moving, just breathing heavily, like he had just run up a flight of stairs or was struggling to breathe. I stood there frozen, unsure of what to do. After about a minute, he slowly shuffled away toward his apartment. I didn't sleep much that night. The next day, I spoke with the property manager. I told her about the weird behavior and how he'd been standing at my door. She frowned and said, "B6? No one's supposed to be living there. That unit's under maintenance for electrical issues." I told her I'd seen him move in, that I saw his furniture, even met him in the hall. She shook her head. That's not possible. The unit's not rented out yet. No keys have been issued. She promised she'd look into it, and I left feeling completely unsettled. That night, I deadbolted my door and left the hallway light on. Around 1 a.m., I heard it again, the breathing. This time, it was closer, like it was right up against the door. I grabbed my phone and quietly started recording a voice memo. Then the doorknob started to turn. Not shake, not rattle, just a slow, steady turn, like someone was carefully testing to see if it was locked. I backed away and called the police. When they arrived, he was gone, but they checked B6, and again it was empty, completely empty. No furniture, no signs anyone had ever stayed there. The locks were untouched. The unit was dark, dusty, and unpowered, just like the property manager had said. The police took my report, but said there was nothing they could do unless something happened again. Before leaving, one of the officers quietly said, "Get a camera. Something's not right." So I did. I set up a small motion trigger camera inside my apartment, pointed toward the front door. 3 nights later, it recorded something. At 3:12 a.m., the camera was triggered. The video showed my doorknob slowly turning, just like before. Then, for 15 solid seconds, the door gently pushed inward, like someone was leaning their weight against it. But the deadbolt held. And then a face came into frame, right up to the peephole. It was him, just staring, breathing, eyes wide and blank. Then he backed away and disappeared. I moved out that week. About 2 years ago, I moved into a small apartment complex just outside of Portland. The building was old but charming. Hardwood floors, creaky stairs, paper-thin walls. I lived on the second floor. Below me was an older man named Walter. He'd been living there for years, the kind of neighbor who didn't say much but always nodded politely if we passed each other on the stairs. For the first few months, everything was normal, peaceful even. I worked remotely, so I spent most days in my apartment with my dog, a beagle named Lucy. Occasionally, I'd hear Walter's TV or footsteps, but that's to be expected in an old building. Then around October, strange things started happening. It started small. I'd come home from a walk with Lucy and find the apartment colder than I left it. Once, my bathroom window was open even though I never opened it. I figured maybe I was getting forgetful, or maybe the old place just had weird drafts. Then one night, I woke up at around 3 a.m. to the sound of my hallway floor creaking. I froze. Lucy was at the foot of my bed, ears up, alert. I sat up and listened. The creaking stopped, followed by a soft thud, like someone slowly closing a door. I checked the entire apartment. Everything was locked. Windows, doors, nothing out of place. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. A few days later, I went down to the laundry room in the basement. As I passed Walter's door, it opened slightly. He looked at me, just watched without a word. I gave a small smile and said, "Morning." He didn't respond, just closed the door. Later that week, while cleaning, I found something that made my stomach turn. Tucked behind my bookshelf was a small plastic bag. Inside were dog treats, the same brand I bought for Lucy, but I didn't put them there. I never stored treats behind the bookshelf. I started wondering if someone had been inside my apartment. I installed a cheap door camera the next day. Nothing fancy, just a motion-activated one with alerts to my phone. For a few nights, everything was quiet. Then at 2:14 a.m. one morning, I got a notification. Motion detected, front door. I checked the footage. It was Walter. He stood in front of my door for several minutes, just listening, not knocking, not trying to handle, just standing still with his ear close to the wood. At one point, he knelt down, maybe looking under the crack of the door, then got up and left. The next day, I reported it to the building manager. She was sympathetic, but said unless he entered my unit or caused a disturbance, there wasn't much they could do. That night, I didn't sleep. I pushed a chair under the doorknob, kept the light on, held Lucy close, and sometime around 3 a.m., I heard something that confirmed my worst fear. The faint sound of a key turning in the lock. Not forceful, not loud, slow, careful. I leapt up and yelled through the door, "I'm calling the cops!" The sound stopped. I rushed to the peephole, but no one was there. The police came. They didn't find anyone in the hall, but they took it seriously this time. I showed them the footage from the night before. They questioned Walter, but he denied everything, said he was asleep, had no idea what I was talking about. Here's the part that still bothers me. When the building replaced my lock the next day, the locksmith pulled out the old one and frowned. "This isn't the original cylinder," he said. "Someone's changed this before." I asked what he meant. He told me it looked like the lock had been swapped out with a cheap duplicate. Same model, same shape, but easy to pick or match with a duplicate key. Whoever did it had access. I moved out a week later. I never saw Walter again, but sometimes I still wonder how many times he'd been inside before I ever noticed.